You know, when you think about buildings that are really old and have really lasted, I got a chance to visit Rome a couple years ago and I saw the Roman Colosseum, 2,000 years old, built from rocks. And what an amazing building material. Fire resistant, UV resistant. Now, 2,000 years later, the Colosseum needs a little bit of work. But my point is, rocks are an amazing building product. And what if I told you that this insulation that I just torched was so flame resistant because it's made from rocks? On the build show today, we're back at my mass timber project where we did full out-sulation instead of insulation. And we're gonna make the case for mineral wool on the full outside of the building. We're gonna get in all the nerdy science and the reasons why I like this building product. Today's build show is sponsored by Rockwool. Let's get going. All right, so I visited Rome. I got to see the Colosseum, 2,000 plus years old, right? Now it had some breakdown, but let's be honest, it wasn't very comfortable. It's not very airtight and certainly didn't have much insulation. Behind me is an example of a mass timber project and is a little more reminiscent of what we build with today. We build with wood as structure in North America. And wood's an amazing product. Think about this tree that we cut down in the forest and we make, let's say, a picnic table out of it. Even if we pressure treat that picnic table, how long will that table last out in the elements? Maybe 20, 30 years before it starts rotting, the boards start cupping, it starts breaking down. On the other hand, our dining room table made from that same wood, maybe a slightly nicer wood, but kept in my dining room, I could pass that same dining room table down from generation to generation. And so if we treat our houses like our dining room table, how long could our houses last? I mean, think about Japanese houses that are 1,000 plus years old that are out of true wood. The reason why they lasted is because we controlled the environment that wood was in. There's 4 things that a house has to control. It has to control water, it has to control air, it has to control vapor, and it has to control thermal control, which is heat transfer, right? A house built today in modern times is going to be a very comfortable place to live because we're controlling the environment, we're not letting air leak in, we're keeping the rain off the house, we're keeping the vapor under control as it moves through the wall so we don't have condensation issues, and lastly, we're putting insulation in so we're comfortable, right? If we're cold outside, is it smarter to put a big jacket on, a big puffy coat, or would we stuff insulation in between our ribs? And so that's a great example for this building right here. So this is a wood framed building, really not too different than a 1,000-year-old Japanese building. All the control layers, all 4 of those things are controlled on the outside of the building. Now we built this with a bit of a modification from some Monopoly framing that you've seen me do in the past. This is a version of Monopoly framing where all the control layers on the outside and nothing is poking through from the inside of the outside, except in this case we do have an overhang. This is 1.5 inch plywood, basically LVL plywood, that's 4 feet wide by 32 feet wide. And when we crane those panels up, we've made overhangs with that. Now we added some strong backs on top of the beams inside and screw those down with some really long Simpson structural screws to support that overhang. But that allowed us to not have anything poking through the exterior envelope. So if you think about this house and a Monopoly framed house, one of the things we really like about it is from the foundation to the ridge, we're continuous in our water control, our air control, our vapor control, and in this case now, also our thermal control, because all the insulation is actually out-sulation. It's on the outside of the building. And that makes for a really well-built house, a very comfortable house, and a very long-lasting house. Now, when we're building a timber frame house, we could really build with the same assembly in any climate zone, whether we're in Texas where it's hot and humid, or we're building in Alaska. The only thing we'd change really on this assembly would be how much out-sulation we're using. Now we're meeting code with this out-sulation here, but if we're gonna build this in Alaska or in a cold climate, we're gonna need a lot more insulation on the outside to meet code. But basically you're just putting a bigger puffy coat on, right? We might put a thin coat in on the wintertime in Texas, or we might put a thick coat on if we're going outside in Minnesota in the wintertime, right? All we're gonna do is change. Now from a building science perspective, what you're seeing here that I really like is this assembly is vapor open. So the full wood shell on the outside of that, we've used a peel and stick product. This happens to be Dorkin's Delta Vent SA, which is a vapor open house wrap. So when we peel and stick that down onto the outside of the building, It's controlling air, it's controlling water, but vapor can actually pass through it. We could dry through it in effect, which is really important. And then this gets to what we've got here, which is the topic of today's video, OUT-sulation. We've chosen on this project Rockwool's Comfort Board 110. This is a full blanket, a full continuous insulation on the outside of the building. Now, we already talked about UV resistance and fire resistance. Those are two natural properties of this mineral wool insulation. But another property that I really like about this insulation is that it's hydrophobic. Water is actually afraid of this insulation. So check this out. If I pour this water bottle out on here, look how it just beads up and runs off on the surface. It literally runs off because it's hydrophobic. Now, if I lift this sheet up, those last little drops will pop right off. And if it does get a little bit wet, it's gonna dry out. This is a vapor open insulation. In comparison to other products, which you can't dry through, which are like a big sheet of cellophane on the outside of the house, this, number one, is not gonna absorb water. And if any water that does get on it, it's gonna run right off. And it can dry in the future and it won't be broken down. I mean, if I were to wet down that rock, what degrading is gonna happen on that rock when it gets wet? Nothing's gonna happen to that rock when it gets wet, right? It's gonna dry harmlessly and not affect it. The same is true with this mineral wool insulation from Rockwool. Now, one other property that I really like about it is because it's made from rocks, it's also very stable dimensionally. A lot of sheet good products that are insulation products will shrink over time and potentially even expand, and they drift in their R value, meaning there's a R value when they are delivered to the job that goes down over time. Whereas this exterior Rockwool insulation, it doesn't move and change, and it's thermally stable for the lifetime of the product. So this happens to be a product that's R4 per inch, and it's gonna stay that same R4 through the lifetime of the product. So now when I put one 3-inch layer on the outside of the building, I can just butt those layers up and they're not gonna move. They're not gonna open up over time. Whereas if I were to use some other insulation products, I'd be worried about that insulation shrinking and I'd have a gap between the insulation panels. So when I use other insulations, I often do 2 layers so that I can go over top of the seam so that when that foam shrinks, I've got another layer on top of that. That's really important with other types of insulation, but not here. And the last property that I want to mention here is that it's naturally bug resistant. So having this on the outside of the building means I'm not going to have things tunneling through it, and I really like that. In comparison to some other products that are absolute highways for bugs, this is not going to have that problem. So I'm also not going to have to spray a bunch of bug control around this house to keep them out. Now, I did do a detail though that you're gonna notice that I really like, that I'll do with any type of exterior insulation, and that's a bug screen at the bottom of the rain screen. Let's go take a closer look at that rain screen in the building. Okay, another detail I used on this project that I really use on everything I build is a rain screen on the outside. If you're in a climate that gets more than 20 inches of annual rainfall, you really should think about a rain screen. What you're seeing here is just a 1x4. Now, this happens to be made out of the same LVL plywood material that the building's made from. But what this is doing is this is screwing right through the Rockwool on the outside. So 3-inch Rockwool and then a 1-inch rain screen. And then my diamond coat siding is gonna get nailed right onto this. So now I've got a 1-inch gap behind that so that any water that gets in, let's say where my diamond coat's butted together, or any water that maybe on a windy day is getting through that lap, is gonna hit that air gap and harmlessly fall out. There's no chance that water is going to get forced into my building. And again, I've got that control layer. I've got that Delta Vent SA behind this Rockwool, continuous from the foundation all the way to the ridge. Now, this house, unlike a traditional Monopoly framed house, does have one break. That plywood cantilever from the roof is coming out. So we did 2 things. We used a product from Dorkin, which is their tape basically at that location. And we also used a bead of Proseco's Fast Flash in there as well. So we've got a belt and suspenders approach, but I don't have rafters poking through other things that would be really hard to air seal. Instead, I just have that plywood sticking out. And again, on the top, I've got a strong back to hold that overhang in place. And then at the bottom of this rain screen, we did something I haven't done before. This is a kind of a doubled up bug screen material. So normally I would just do this. This is an aluminum screen that you can buy in a 3-foot roll. We'll just cut it off. We'll lap this onto the sheathing, before the Rockwool goes on and before the rain screen goes on, and then it gets lapped up and just pinned. This time we went to one step further when we used the hardware cloth. We're out on a ranch property outside of Austin. We just thought we'd give it a little extra protection. I am a little concerned with it, that it may be kicking out my diamond coat, so I hope that's gonna work. It's possible that that experiment may not work perfectly, but you want at least a bug screen material. Even though that Rockwool is naturally bug resistant, we do have that 1-inch gap in here, and so this is gonna give me some protection from bugs coming behind my siding and maybe tunneling up. And you'll also notice that I've got some foundation showing back here. This is really a good detail. We're up off the ground. We're not gonna have water that's gonna be absorbing here. We've got gutters on the full property, and we've got real nice overhangs. Now let's talk about installation. I mentioned I've got a 1 3-inch layer on my walls. I've got 2 3-inch layers on my roof. And when this product gets delivered to the job site, we happen to order the 4-foot by 6-foot by 3-inch thick sheets. So those are basically an R12 panel that we're putting on the house. Now they weigh a fair amount. These are 55 pounds. Remember, this is made from rock, so it's not a lightweight product. It has a little bit of heft to it. You got to think about that. PPE is pretty straightforward though. You really just need gloves, long sleeves, and a dust mask when you're handling it. But at this stage here, you're totally safe. And again, because that water will just run right off this and it's UV resistant, I'm not worried about getting my cladding on really quickly. This is protecting my Delta Vent SA, which is behind there, my WRB. Now, last thing I want to mention on this is you can get this in a bunch of different varieties. I've used Comfort Board 80 before, as well as this 110. This is a little bit more dense, which makes it a little heavier. It also is going to kind of resist that screw being put in, and made this detail with putting this rain screen on really easy, because when we put these Simpson SDWS screws on, it doesn't compress really at all because it's so thick and dense. Now, if you get the 80 material, you can also get that in a 2-foot by 4-foot section. I suspect there might be some other options as well in the 110, but Rockwool's got a great network of reps out there that help you, and they've got a great tech department too. So if you've got some specific questions about your project, you need a little help in figuring out what to specify, give those guys a call. They're really easy to work with. Let's finish up on the outside here by just reviewing this wall section. So we've got our rain screen material, we've got diamond coat siding coming on, and then you can see behind that we've got that continuous WRB, which is my really bomber air and water barrier, but it's vapor open, so my whole assembly is vapor open, and then the entire structure on this building is wood. Now, we're not going to use interior insulation on this project. Of course you could, but we've designed the house to have all out-sulation. So just to review, this house has all exterior insulation, no interior insulation. Let's go inside and I'll give you a quick tour so you can kind of see what that gives us. All right, so this project is a barn-dominium project. We're in the barn side right here. This is basically a big garage, a shop space, a storage space. And remember, we've got that full out-sulation on the outside, which means I don't need any insulation on the inside. And so we're actually gonna leave this space open. This is gonna be basically what you see. We'll probably end up doing a whitewash on these walls, or maybe even a black wash. We're talking about that. But this whole space is open, and that means that I don't need any interior insulation because that insulation's on the outside. We'll hang one mini split on the wall here, and that's all it'll take to space condition, heat or cool this space. Now, as we walk into the house, we are going to be doing some wood paneling and some other things to kind of cover up the structure that you see in the house, but we don't need inside insulation. We can put it in if we want. It would increase our energy efficiency. It would take us above code if we want to, but I don't have to do that if we don't want to. So these wall cavities, we'll run wires, and then we'll have some type of paneling or wood siding, interior cladding, I should say here, to cover up the structure. But again, we could leave the structure exposed if we wanted to on the inside. And this is pretty. This is a super interesting project. I made a bunch of videos here. Big thanks to Simpson, to Diamond Coat, to Rockwool. They've been great partners on this project. And if you're not currently using Rockwool, think about joining their R-Class program. They have a great program for builders with a lot of good benefits. I'll put a link to that in the description below, but thanks to those guys for sponsoring today's video. Inspector's calling again, sorry. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it, brother. Okay, not part of the video, but whenever your inspector calls, take it, no matter what you're doing. You could be getting married and you should still take that phone call. Anyways, big thanks to our partners and friends. This has been a really interesting and very cool project. And of course, we've got all kinds of interesting stuff on the Build Show. I get to travel. I'm actually going to Norway soon. We're doing a whole video series that I'm doing start to finish called the Reisinger build. We got some really cool stuff going on here. So if you're not currently a subscriber, guys, hit that subscribe button below. New content every Tuesday and every Friday. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on the Build Show.